Hey everyone, welcome back to Spicy BL Reads. And this go around, I'm going to be following up with the next chapter of I wanted to manipulate him at first. Now I've become obsessed. And we're going to go right ahead and start from chapter 2. But before we do, remember in the last chapter, the first chapter, we got our first introduction from Kim to Porchay and vice versa. And it was basically a very dark and unsettling introduction being met to Porchay from Kim after Kim basically beat up his uncle and used his uncle as an example. And even though he wanted to intimidate Portia almost. He couldn't help but be smitten with him. So who knows what's going to happen in this next chapter? I do know that the last ending of the last chapter, it gave an obvious indication that Kim was going to do whatever he could to accidentally cross paths with Portia again. So who knows if we're going to pick up right into that, into this next chapter, or maybe we'll get a little more insight on Portia, his character, and everything that involves his life, leading up to potentially meeting Kim again. Anyway, let's get right into it. So, yeah, this is the beginning of chapter 2. Portia knelt beside the bed, his hand shaking as he dabbed a damp cloth against Ati's bloodied face. The weight of the encounter, Kim's cold, calculating stare, the terrible, looming threat of death, still lingered in the room, suffocating and inescapable. Portia's breath came in shallow gasps, trying to steady himself, but the fear that gripped his chest made it impossible to think clearly. What had he done? And what was he supposed to do now? He couldn't undo Kim's actions. He couldn't change the way the man had looked at him, how that look had stirred something in him he wasn't ready to acknowledge. He tried to push it down. Later, he would think about that. Later, he could try to make sense of it. The door creaked open, and Portia didn't need to look up to know who it was. The familiar presence, the steady rhythm of his brother's footsteps, was a comforting sound in the midst of all this chaos. Portia's heart gave a quiet, desperate leap. Finally. His brother stepped into the room, his gaze immediately taking in the damage. His eyes flicked over Portia, registering the blood, the shock on his face, and then he looked at their uncle. Ati, a limp, bloody heap on the couch, his usual bluster and bravado nowhere to be seen. The anger on Portia's face was immediate, sharp, quick, and bitter. What the hell happened here? Portia's voice was rough, a mix of confusion and fury. Portia didn't immediately respond. Instead, he reached for the cloth again, dabbing it against Ati's face, though it did little to stop the bleeding. His hands shook and his vision blurred, the weight of the night's events finally starting to catch up with him. But he wasn't ready to fall apart just yet. Not in front of Portia. It's complicated, Portia murmured, barely able to meet his brother's eyes. Complicated? Portia's tone darkened. each word more laden with frustration than the last. What did he do this time? Portia swallowed, trying to force some words through the lump in his throat. How could he explain this? How could he make Porsche understand the gravity of the situation? The man they just crossed paths with, he wasn't just anyone. Kim Hunt. He was involved with something bad, Portia said, his voice quiet but steady. Portia's jaw clenched at his words, his eyes narrowing as they drifted over their uncle's form. What kind of bad? Portia glanced at his brother, fighting back the swirl of emotions inside him. He didn't want to drag Portia into this mess, but he had no choice. Not now. Not after what had happened. Kim Kinhan was here, Portia said, his voice barely audible, as if saying it aloud would somehow make it all more real. Porsche froze. His face drained of color, and for a long moment he didn't speak. The name had the same effect on him as it did on anyone who had heard it: shock, disbelief, and the subtle, undeniable fear that came with it. Kim? Porsche repeated, his voice low and incredulous. The Kim Hunt, the youngest Dirapanyakun's son. Porsche nodded, his heart sinking in his chest. Porsche's hand dropped to his side, the tension in his posture palpable as he processed the gravity of the situation. God damn it, uncle, Porsche muttered, shaking his head. What did you do? Ati stirred weakly on the couch, his eyes opening, though they were clouded with pain and confusion. I was trying to help, he protested faintly. Help? Portia's voice cracked with anger. What did you think you were doing? You've gambled away our house, our parents' life insurance. What helping was this? Portia's gaze flicked back to his uncle, who was muttering incoherently. This wasn't the first time Ati had dragged them into a mess like this. Every time, Porsche had been the one to clean it up. Every damn time. You always do this, don't you? Porsche hissed, stepping closer to the couch. Make everything 10 times worse, and we're left picking up the pieces. His voice was thick with frustration, but it wasn't aimed at Portia. It was for Ati, as it always was. Portia felt the weight of it, the years of dealing with their uncle's reckless choices, the silent responsibility he'd been, or at least the responsibility he'd placed on Portia's shoulder. His brother had been the one to keep everything from falling apart, but Portia could see it now, the cracks in the foundation. Portia was tired. He was so tired. I'm sorry, Portia whispered, his throat tight. Porsche turned to him, his expression softening despite the fury still burning in his eyes. He stepped closer, kneeling beside Portia, his hand resting on his brother's shoulder in a rare show of comfort. Shay, Porsche said quietly, his voice calm despite everything. You have nothing to apologize for. This isn't your fault. You don't need to apologize for him. Portia met his brother's eyes, feeling the rush of relief. Portia always knew exactly what to say, and for a brief moment he could feel the tension in his chest loosen. He wasn't alone in this. He had Porsche, and Porsche always came through, always put him first. Porsche stood, brushing his hair back from his face, his expression hardening once more. I'm done cleaning up after him, Shay. I can't keep doing this. He's put us in danger one too many times. Portia nodded, his heart heavy, but a part of him understood. Portia had been the one to hold everything together, to pick up every single mess Ati made, but even the strongest had their limits. He could see it in his brother's eyes now, the weariness, the quiet resignation. He didn't need to say it aloud. Portia understood. Portia turned toward Ati, his voice quiet but filled with finality. This time, I'm done. Portia didn't know what to say to that. What could he say? Ati had made his bed and now it was too late to fix things. But he knew, deep down, that Portia would take care of it, like he always did. Go to bed, Shay, Portia said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. We'll figure this out tomorrow. Portia nodded, letting himself lean into his brother's touch, allowing the comfort to wash over him. He wasn't alone. Not now, not ever. With Portia by his side, he could face anything. As Portia finally drifted to sleep, his mind refused to quiet. No matter how hard he tried to push it away, he couldn't escape the haunting image of Kim's eyes. The way they'd pierced through him, cold and calculating, yet something deeper lingered there. The touch of Kim's hand, that unsettling but oddly comforting brush against his arm, kept replaying in his mind, and the scent, it lingered in the air, sharp and undeniable, like the storm before a crash. What was it about him? Why did he feel so unsettled? It wasn't just fear, not entirely. No, it was something else. Something that he couldn't quite grasp. But as the night enveloped him and the darkness took over, one thing was clear. He couldn't stop thinking about Kim Hunt. And that thought, more than anything, kept him awake long after his eyes closed. Alright, guys, so this is the ending of chapter 2. And right now I'm going to do a little bit of an analysis. By the way, if you can hear like crazy background, I don't know what's going on either, so please forgive me. I do hope I'm talking more than loud enough into the mic so that you can hear me. So, yeah, my analysis of the second chapter of Breathless Pursuit. So, the first theme that stood out to me in the entire chapter was like, the aftermath of chapter 1 when Kim introduced himself to Portia accidentally because he actually came to Portia's uncle to beat him up. I don't know if I can say that on YouTube, but he came to basically get his bag back from Portia's uncle. And yeah, so now in chapter 2, the obvious theme of confronting like chaos and fear. So with that being said, right, one of the talking points is that Portia is obviously in a state of shock and fear after a violent encounter with Kim that left his uncle, Ati, seriously injured. Um, I guess when I read the chapter, it was pretty obvious that it wasn't Portia's first time cleaning up after his uncle, who I assume is maybe an alcoholic, but he's definitely somebody that likes to gamble and put the family in debt. So it was pretty apparent that in this chapter, Portia's not any stranger to helping clean up after his uncle gets beat up by people that he owes. So that obviously left some trauma on Portia and made him feel like he has to pick up the pieces and parentify his uncle, and it also made him feel like he's potentially an extra burden to his brother Porsche, which obviously sucks. He shouldn't feel that way, but that's the situation he's in. And overall, I'd say it's a very good thing that he knows he could always rely on his brother nonetheless. Hopefully, that doesn't lead Portia feeling like that to any extremes and wanting to quote unquote lighten the load for Porsche. But anyway, uh, that's one of the things that stood out, that he's in a state of shock and fear, which is nothing new. The second thing that stood out to me was Portia struggling to explain the complexity of the situation to Porsche, basically putting emphasis on Kim's involvement and how quote unquote fucked everything is from this moment on. Like, he's basically telling Porsche, like, oh, a guy from the mafia is here, and I don't know how to tell my brother how deep of a hole our uncle brought us in this time around. And oddly enough, Porsche, it's implied that Porsche knows exactly who Kim is, which I don't understand how he could know that, because in this story, there's no indication yet what Porsche does for a living, so I'm a little surprised how he even knows Kim in the first place. But I guess we'll be getting onto that. And another thing that I remembered from this chapter was that both of the brothers were experiencing like overwhelming emotions as they were confronting the reality of the situation, the predicament that they found themselves in, especially in association with Kim's notoriety. And I say I'm surprised that Porsche even knows who Kim is, because Kim, he's known, he's around, and from the sounds of it, how everyone's making it, he seems like he's really into some wild stuff, especially pertaining to the mafia that he's a part of. Super interesting, I must say. But I'd say that the overall chapter, it highlights a theme of brotherhood and vulnerability in the face of looming threats, if you will. And as I previously mentioned, there was an obvious theme of family struggles and the limits of responsibility. So when Porsche confronted his uncle Ati about the consequences of his reckless gambling, which led to significant financial issues for the family, right? Um, you could very well see that Ati once again was just used to doing whatever he wanted and leaving Porsche or anybody else behind to clean it up. He has no regard for what his addiction is causing. He has no regard for what his addiction is doing to his family, the family's finances, and the overall safety of his nephews. I mean, I want to empathize with Ati in a sense because he's an addict, but at the same time, I mean, both of the brothers have to do what they have to do to save themselves. I mean, what more could they lose? They lost their family, they lost their inheritance from their parents. Every day they have to go play hide and seek away from debt collectors. They have to deal with frequent trauma of seeing their uncle assaulted, basically. And having to piece everything back together just for it to be torn down all over again. I mean, that is traumatic for anybody. So I definitely understood Portia's anger towards Ati. However, it's also highlighted how Porsche never directed his anger towards Portia. Like he never tried to make Portia feel like he needed to make up for what his uncle's done. He never made Portia feel like he had to apologize for his uncle. None of that. So that lets me know that Porsche and Porsche's always had a relationship where reassuring each other was a vital and enthusiastic thing that they did for one another to keep each other close by. Rightfully so. And you also see where Portia recognizes Portia's struggles and understands that the emotional toll that everything and their uncle's behavior and all of the bad luck that came behind their uncle's carelessness has taken on him. And the situation just basically highlights the theme of family responsibility, sacrifice, and the impact of one person's choices on the entire family dynamic. So, throughout all of that, you could see where Porsche provides comfort to Porsche. He's emphasizing, I don't know what's up with my speech right now, but emphasizing the support of brotherhood in challenging times. And throughout all of this, Porsche is definitely grappling with unsettling thoughts about Kim, which it reveals like a complicated mix of fear and intrigue. Like, obviously, he's infamous. He's heard about Kim. Kim's the one that's infamous. He's heard about Kim and he hears that he's dangerous, but I mean, he can't help the feeling of Kim maybe potentially flirting with him, like the way he was looking at him, his tone. I mean, if you guys remember in the first chapter, when Kim first met Portia, he was Mr. Boss Man to everybody else, but all of a sudden, he has a very soft and calming voice to Portia. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure that was a very calculated move from Kim's end, but it was still an interesting thing to be introduced to because I guess it sets the tone for what we'll be able to see in the upcoming chapters. Was he purposely being calculating towards Portia, or was he genuinely lost into how cute and intriguing he found Portia? But anyway, you could still see that after Kim's departure, his presence still haunts Portia, and it's obviously indicated, as I previously mentioned, by like vivid memories and sensory details that linger, and it highlights Portia's internal conflict, and it blends discomfort and an inexplicable connection to Kim. But anyway, that's my analysis of what happened in the second chapter. And I'd like to know what you guys think of this second chapter. And yeah, I guess we'll see each other or talk to each other the next time around. Bye, guys.